Hi there, Jonathan here. The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website where you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. That's at www.jonathanfoust.com. Thank you and enjoy. I'd like to start with a classic teaching story. A beggar had been sitting by the side of the road for over 30 years. One day a stranger walked by. "Spare some change," mumbled the beggar, mechanically holding out his old baseball cap. "I have nothing to give you," said the stranger. Then he asked, "Well, what's that you're sitting on?" "Nothing," replied the beggar, "just an old box. I've been sitting on it for as long as I can remember." "Ever look inside?" asked the stranger. "No, what's the point? There's nothing in there." "Have a look inside," insisted the stranger. And the beggar managed to pry open the lid, and with astonishment, disbelief, and elation, he saw that the box was filled with gold coins. We tend to look outside ourselves for happiness and for fulfillment. In fact, we're completely enamored with the pursuit of happiness through what's outside of us. And the question, of course, is how do we stop that outer search and explore what's inside? So tonight's talk is about renunciation, about letting go, how to let go of the externals and to open to the internals, to open to what's inside. Gandhi said that a person of knowledge attains peace only through renunciation. So it's only through letting go. And just to counterbalance that with Andrew Carnegie, I can't believe he said this, but he said the secret of happiness is renunciation. So there's something around that turning away and turning inward that opens something up inside of us. Freud said this: "It's impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built upon a renunciation of instinct." So we have these built-in desires and instincts. How do we shift our relationship to them in a way that is skillful? So this is the third of the 10 perfections. The first is on cultivating generosity. The second is cultivating kind of ethical moral behavior. And this is about exploring renunciation. And the 10 perfections is kind of a horrible title, but really what they are these qualities that seem to reflect someone who is awake. Someone who is awake in their life is naturally inherently generous. Someone who is awake naturally doesn't harm, seeks social justice, etc. And someone who is awake is naturally more present to the inner world than relying on the outer world for happiness. So I'd like to talk about the importance of goals and the problem of distraction. Wow. It's amazing they sync that up so perfectly. Cue the phone. I think I mentioned Sokni Rinpoche, one of my favorite teachers. Whenever a phone rings, he always says, "I hope it's good news." So the importance of goals and the problem of distraction and the art of simplifying your life and what it means to live from simplicity. So I ran across an interesting headline the other day. And the headline is, "Why 3% of Harvard MBAs make 10 times as much as the other 97% combined." That's quite the headline. Got me to read it. So Harvard has a 15% acceptance rate. So most of the people who apply to Harvard have got a fair bit of stuff going on in their lives. They're pretty standout people. And so they did this research a little while ago, and they found out that 84% of people attending Harvard had no specific goals in life. 13% had goals, but they hadn't written them down. And 3% had clear written goals and plans. Many years later, they checked back in, and they found that the 13% who had goals were earning twice as much as the 84% who didn't have any goals. And the 3% were earning 10 times as much as the other 97%. So I'm not advocating that making a lot of money is the end-all and be-all, of course. But it is an interesting reflection. If you're going to business school, it's about making money. And there does seem to be some relationship between having very clear goals, knowing what they are, and having those goals direct your life. And so it's important for each of us to really ask ourselves, what do you want? What are your goals? If you were to write down the top 3 things you want out of life, what would they be? I've mentioned this in every one of these talks on the 10 perfections. But one way to think about these teachings is they're kind of best practices. They're ways to kind of compare how you're doing with what you want out of life. And so it's always a question. When you know what you want, you're always asking, is there a more effective way that I can organize my life to move me toward what I want? And I think no matter what your goals are in life, ultimately they come down to a desire to see more clearly into the nature of reality. A desire to be truly happy, to be truly free. So for me, I have worldly goals. I set out goals, but I think ultimately for me, what I'm really seeking in life is to be happy no matter what the external circumstances. I also have a goal of being a contribution. I'd like to give more than I take, if that's possible. So if you have goals, it's helpful, but of course, any goal is going to have inherent challenges. I do a lot to stay focused on goals. Every year I write an annual report and I set my goals, and now I'm due for my 6-month integrity report, where I sit down, I look at what I said I was going to do, and I try to be brutally realistic about how well I'm doing and what kind of course adjustments I need to make. So I recently ran into a pretty big distraction. So a little confession. Have you heard of YouTube Red? You know what that is? You pay a monthly fee, and then all those annoying ads just disappear. There are other benefits, but I didn't even look at those. It was just the irritation around those horrible ads. You have to sit there. So many times they'll just dump a page because I can't take that stuff. So, free trial, sign up and give it a shot. Technology is so interesting. It can be such a force for good. But as you know, it can be an incredible challenge as well. I had heard that the second book published after the Bible was pornography. And as you know, in the internet, I was curious about that and I found out that apparently 4 or 5 out of 10 web searches are for pornography. It's pretty crazy. Technology has a way of like hitting the lower chakra and then slowly working its way up, I think. Anyway, back to YouTube. YouTube's an amazing way to get information. I actually watched a tutorial on how to fix an ice maker on a GE Profile refrigerator the other day. Someone actually did that. And, my talks are on YouTube, and it's a wonderful way to get stuff out there. But I signed up for this YouTube Red, and guess what? I started watching a lot more YouTube. Dumb YouTube, like time-killing and brain-numbing YouTube. And I could feel this addiction settle in. Suddenly I'm watching a 10-minute romp through the historical accuracy of the movie 300. I'm watching a camera review of a camera I already own. And a comparison of camera bags I never needed, but now I'm seriously thinking I have to have one of these things. And it's really clear that I've got to dump this service. I've got to get off it. There's so much I want to do, and when I look back, nothing I've been doing has felt wholesome on YouTube. So it's an interesting reflection. How much time out of one of your days goes into activities that don't really serve where you want to go? How many hours slip by? I think I had mentioned this before, but I always find it helpful. There are 4 quadrants of how you spend your time. One quadrant is just reacting to all the stuff that has to be reacted to. The phone call you weren't expecting, the email you have to write, the thing that broke. The second quadrant is all the stuff you said you were going to do, your to-do list. And the third quadrant is strategic planning, kind of asking yourself, is what I'm doing today really lined up with where I want to be 10 years from now? And then the fourth quadrant is everything you do that's about the present. It's not just meditation, it's art, it's poetry, it's being in nature. And if we don't pay careful attention, everything slides into that first quadrant, where all you're doing is reacting to what's happening. And so much of the practice is around shifting the way we spend our time. So one of the challenges of technology, of course, is that it really taps into the brain. Your awareness is pretty much designed to be scanning full time to pick out the things that might kill you and make sure that you're safe. And the technology now is so designed to capture your attention and to pull you in. So it can be painful to reflect on how much of your time slips away from where you really, really want it to be. And it's helpful to really pause and assess. One of the core teachings through this lens of Buddhist psychology is to consciously pause and ask yourself, is what I'm doing now resulting in a more wholesome state or a less wholesome state? And finally, it dawned on me that YouTube Red is not cultivating a more wholesome state. So then it becomes a question of how do you simplify your life? How do you align what you really want with where you want to go? And there's a very, very core teaching that says that seeking for happiness through the externals, through fulfilling sensual pleasure, is not going to lead to long-term happiness. And part of what we need to do is to sort of wake ourselves up out of that. And there are different approaches through the millennia of how to create that awareness. Some of them pretty extreme, kind of the classical teachings. So I'll talk about them in a moment. There's a story about Ananda, who was the Buddha's assistant. And he went into the Buddha and he sat down and he said this. He said, there are those of us who are householders, that is to say, not monks, but living in the world with families and responsibilities, who indulge in sexuality, delight in sensuality, enjoy and rejoice in our sensual lives. Renunciation seems like a drop-off. Yet I've heard the teachings, and I know that young monks leap up at renunciation. They grow confident and steadfast and firm, and they tap into inner peace. And this is where the doctrine and the discipline is contrary to the great mass of people. So he's saying, I love my life. I love my worldly life. And I can't imagine why someone would want to jump into a renunciate path. I like the idea. It makes sense, but it seems extreme. It's kind of what Ananda was saying. And the Buddha says, so it is. Even myself, before my awakening, when I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, thought renunciation is good, seclusion is good. But my heart didn't leap up at renunciation. It didn't grow confident, steadfast, or firm, seeing it as an avenue to peace. So basically the Buddha is saying, yeah, I totally get it. I felt the same way earlier in my life. Then he goes on and he says, and then the thought occurred to me, what is the reason why my heart doesn't leap up at the idea of renunciation? And the thought occurred to me, I haven't seen the drawback of sensual pleasures. I haven't pursued that theme. I haven't understood the reward of renunciation. And that is why my heart doesn't leap up at the idea of renunciation. So basically the Buddha is saying, I feel exactly the same way, but I never really thought it through. And so then the Buddha goes on to say, when I looked very closely at this, I began to see that pursuing sensual pleasures in the world would not lead to long-term happiness. And part of his initial awakening was realizing everybody is looking for happiness in exactly the wrong way, by pursuing it through external goals. Our life is run by desire. In fact, there's something referred to as the wheel of Samsara. And the wheel of Samsara refers to this cycle of life that we go through. And desire is what puts the entire wheel in motion. So the antidote to desire is non-desire. So a little Zen pop quiz meditation. If you'd like, you can close your eyes. You might just take a moment just to feel the breath on the inside. You might again just feel the sounds around you. And you might just take a moment to contemplate, who are you in the absence of desire? What if in this moment there was nothing to add and nothing to take away? And then if you like, you can deepen the breath. And if you like, you can open the eyes, or you can remain with them closed if you like. I've heard it said that enlightenment is simply the absence of desire. And that's why the practice of gratitude and appreciation is so profound. When you turn your attention to what you're grateful for or what you appreciate, there's an arriving, it's a shift in consciousness that you can feel in your body. And so we undertake certain practices that help us to step back from being caught in the worldly winds. And I've had the opportunity in my life to practice some forms of renunciation. I was a member of a vowed order for 13 or 14 years, and we had we called it a vow of simplicity, but it was basically a vow of poverty for those years, and a formal vow of celibacy for, I think it was about 6 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 12 hours, 36 minutes, somewhere in there. I've shared this before, but the poverty vow in my 20s and 30s was a lot easier than the celibacy vow in my 20s and 30s. But I have to say, I learned so much. Those years were so instrumental in helping shape my life. Now, my vow of poverty, I have to say, wasn't too excruciating. I was living in a middle-class ashram in the United States. I didn't want for anything. But it forced me to live simply. I lived in a monk cell and learned how to live simply. A couple things that I learned over those years. One was recognizing how outer focused I was in my life. I was focused on external things that I thought would make me happy. And particularly in terms of practicing celibacy, I was very focused on the idea of an external relationship that was going to make me happy. And deciding not to engage in that way showed all of my longing and wanting and fantasy. All of that became very, very clear. All my internal posturing around relationships, all of that became very evident. And it was very interesting as well, particularly in terms of the refraining from sexuality. I suddenly saw that there were people that I would have pursued, but I definitely didn't have the emotional maturity to maintain a relationship. And because I didn't cross that line, those people became really good friends. And conversely, I had more intimacy in my life than I had ever had before. I got to watch desire come and go through those years. And I realized how I'd be so lost in some external desire, and then realize it would pass. And then I would forget all about that desire as if it never existed. So living simply was very, very helpful for me. And I've really come to appreciate having few things, but enjoying what I have. And there are a variety of teachings about renunciation. Again, I'm so grateful I actually had formal vows where I got to experience what it was like to kind of pull back. But the classical teachings over the years, some of them are really quite extreme. They were designed to basically transform lust into disgust. And if you look back over some of the kind of the classical practices, particularly for the renunciates, but even for lay people, that you would do meditations on a rotting corpse, or you would go to a funeral pyre and you would watch a body, decompose, as a reminder that what you are seeking is bound to change, to see clearly that fundamental teaching of impermanence. There's a meditation which is really quite profound and horrible, which I will spare you, where you reflect on all the different parts that make up a body, and you imagine them in different buckets. So there's a bucket with skin, a bucket with hair, a bucket with bones, a bucket with blood. And again, it definitely turns your attention to the recognition of impermanence. There's a really kind of a cool argument going on out there in the Dharma world, of those who are saying that we've watered down these core teachings around renunciation. When the core teachings say you have to observe the body through this lens of impermanence, you have to recognize that worldly desire is basically empty. And pursuing that will lead to this never-ending cycle of samsara. But basically they come down to these first two of the Noble Truths, that stress and suffering in life are a fact, that all experiences contain suffering, and the seed of suffering is desire, and that there's a cause and a source of that stress and suffering. That you cannot eliminate stress and suffering by satisfying your cravings, because pleasure just creates more pleasure. Satisfying cravings keeps the wheel spinning. So when you practice renunciation, you're reversing it. Here's what Chogyam Trungchen Rinpoche says. It is not just a matter of giving up attachment to this life's rewards, but losing our taste and affinity for the whole worldly experience. This is why it's necessary to contemplate and meditate upon the faults of conditioned existence. Otherwise, we may imagine... I'm going to skip that part. He goes on, he says, consider a person who has a sickness that causes vomiting. As soon as he sees something revolting, he will immediately retch uncontrollably. This is how you should feel toward conditioned existence, a sense of revulsion rather than attraction. So that kind of sums up one point of view in the teachings. Train yourself to view this world through this lens of disgust, if you will. This is not just some Asian macho approach. We see this in the West as well, through a lot of the Western religions that are very much based on revulsion of the body and the rejection of sensual pleasure. So the question is how do we live our lives with this awareness? Do we just focus on revulsion of the worldly life, or is there another way? And the Buddha spoke of this. He said there are two extremes not to be practiced. Indulgence of sense pleasure, which is low, coarse, the way of ordinary people, unworthy and unprofitable. That's one. And two, self-mortification, which is painful, unworthy, and unprofitable. So basically the Buddha is saying, if you think you can find eternal happiness by indulging into the senses, you might be mistaken. But if you think you can find true happiness by denying the senses, you may find that is not beneficial either. So each one of us has to find this middle way. When you really understand the nature of impermanence, you can engage into life in a very powerful and dynamic way. You know that this life is temporal. You know that everything is going to change. And when you know that and live from that, you can be very creative in this life. So, stepping back from the worldly life and viewing it as impermanent, that's all very helpful. And I can say this a little bit about my own experience. In particular, one month-long retreat that I went on. So it was all in silence, and I was really trying to be as moment to moment aware as I could be. So, all the meals are in silence. I would try to move slowly from one thing to the next. And the thing about being on a retreat, particularly a Vipassana retreat, is it's about removing distractions. So it's the same schedule every day, the same practice every day. The idea is you remove external distraction and get very, very present. So of course, as I'm settling into that retreat, I'm beset by all kinds of memories and all kinds of hallucinations and planning. And, I'd follow that track and bring it back and follow that track and bring it back. And after a while, it began to become more settled. And I began to believe a little bit less of what my mind was telling me as actually being true. And then there was a period of time where I became more and more present. And there's something that can arise, which we've all tasted at different times. And it's referred to as rapture. This sense of well-being that arises out of being present without any desire whatsoever. And I discovered in that retreat, I've been meditating since I was 15 on a regular basis, that there was something about removing all those worldly distractions, over the course of that month, where I had quite a few days where I experienced levels of an inner bliss that I had never experienced before. Part of that was coming from what I was doing, which was sort of concentration practice and bringing metta into this kind of alchemy in my practice. But a lot of it came from what I was not doing. I wasn't chasing things externally. I'm so grateful for that experience, because it was such a reminder of what can happen in letting go of chasing worldly stuff and deeply, deeply mining into the present moment. Most people who've had some success in their lives have learned how to cut out distractions. They've learned how to kind of renounce the wandering, distracted mind to bring it on point. And there's some sacrifice in that process. So I think much of looking at how we shift from the outer world to the inner world is looking at different skillful means. I had a really busy retreat. I had a retreat on Saturday, which was really fun, and then a full day yesterday. And so I had this talk to finish. And there's a little thing that I do. I had mentioned this before. I use these audio programs that I use dual binaural beats, which are a way to kind of shift your brainwave states. And the one I'm using now is called Focus at Will, where they take different soundtracks that are designed to help you focus. And I put on headphones, and I set the timer for 25 minutes. And for that 25 minutes, laser focus on what I'm working on. And then I take a forced break at 25 minutes, and then I do it again. And it's a very powerful practice for me because I have this thing called YouTube Red that just pulls my attention everywhere. So learning how to focus is really a form of renunciation. You're renouncing the distracted thoughts to focus on what's most important. And I'm sure you've noticed that there are times in your life where everything is lined up and you're being incredibly efficient. And no doubt that's practicing some form of renouncing that distracted, wanting, grasping, craving mind and bringing it back to what you really, really want. So again, it comes back to asking yourself what you really want. I mentioned earlier how I really want to write this book. And through ruthless self-assessment, I see the ways I get pulled off. But I have a choice. And whenever you meditate, and when you came in here to meditate today, you're partaking in a form of worldly renunciation. You're disengaging from the conditioned mind. You're choosing an anchor to focus your attention internally. When the mind wanders to all the external world and sense pleasure and planning and all the stuff you want to get done, you notice that, you bring it back, you re-arrive, maybe just for a millisecond. But when you do that, something profound shifts. It might be that you're aware of how exhausted you really are. It might be you feel a little more present. It might be that when you go back to your life, you're going to be a little bit more responsive and a little bit less reactive. This very simple practice of finding an anchor in the senses, breath or sound, doesn't matter. When the mind wanders, you bring it back. So simple. And yet, over 10,000 studies being done on the brain have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that that little practice will transform your life. It'll transform your physiology. It'll transform your emotional equilibrium. It'll transform your mental clarity, your relationship to intuition. All of that gets transformed through that very act of renunciation, if you will. So, of course, the question becomes, if you're living a busy life in the world, how do you remember to disengage from the world that inevitably will snap you up and call you in? Anything you can do to help you remember is important. And of course, the classical teachings say, develop some ritual, some daily ritual, where you can pause. And in that pause, you'll be a little more relaxed, a little more awake. And when you go back into that conditioned world, your own sense of purpose will guide you for a while. The other thing you can do is to consciously step away from your life into some intensive time of practice. I grew up in the Pennsylvania Dutch country, and the farm I grew up on had about 5 or 6 different caves within maybe a 2-mile radius, these limestone caves. And so as kids, we used to go and explore these caves. And one of the things I loved about like kind of being underground for a couple hours was when I came out, all the smells that I just hadn't noticed before. And in many ways, that's what a retreat can do when you step back, when you when you can get very, very calm and very present. And again, when you move back into the world, you'll see things you hadn't noticed before. You'll notice things you hadn't noticed before. And the third element is to be around like-minded people, because we so easily get caught up into the busyness of this world. And when you're around others who want to be awake inside the conditioned world, there's nothing quite as powerful as that. So, renunciation is important. It's reminding yourself what you most want out of this life. Carlos Castaneda said, "Keep death on your left shoulder. Keep death as an advisor. Whenever you have a decision to make in your life, check in with your consultant." It's a helpful practice. And I think this practice really comes down to two words, and that is to let go. When you step back from the busyness of your life, you touch into something that's core. It's who and what you truly are. And I think what these teachings say is the more you can do that, the more you will be in touch with your own heart, your own life, and your own path. And that truly is what this is all about. Why don't we take a few moments just to close with a short meditation. And you might again just feel the breath. And as you breathe, just to sense this inner world, this breath, and this life you are living. And you might sense the outer world of your relationships, your responsibilities, your commitments, your obligations. And just a sense in your own way, the more you can pause, the more you can bring into your life an awake mind and a full heart. And deepening your breath. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open. Thank you for your attention. A few announcements. First, and Ben, you need a ride? Someone who could offer Ben a ride to Ballston? Oh, you've got one. It's all locked in. Fantastic. Anyone else need a ride? Cool. I'd like to invite Hannah to come up. She's got a quick announcement, a very cool thing happening here in DC. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Hannah, and I am starting a young adult Sangha with a couple other women. It's for 19 to 39-year-olds in this area. And we're meeting in D.C. at the Lamont Dharma House, which is in Mount Pleasant. The first meeting is Saturday from 2 to 4, and we'll be meeting once a month on third Saturdays. Oh, God. Third Saturdays. So just another opportunity to practice renunciation, letting go. And there are these postcards outside on the table, so if you know anyone who might want to participate, please feel free to invite them. And really, it's for anyone in that age range, just to experience this practice, experience each other in the same time of life. So Thank you.
Thank you. What a great offering. That can really make a difference in someone's life. If you're interested or know anyone who might benefit, thanks for making that happen. Yeah, and so Hannah, you'll be maybe outside if you want to check in with her. Great. Thank you as always for your support for the class. It makes a big difference. If you want to be on the mailing list, you can sign up in the back as well. And there's not going to be a formal discussion group tonight. So just want to mention that. We'll kind of pick that up next week. So have a wonderful time out there in the world of sensual pleasures. We'll see you next week.